Hey, it's been a while since I uploaded a video to my YouTube channel. Um, I don't have anything important to show you right now, but I do want to talk a little bit about React Native because recently I encountered people who aren't sure whether they should use React Native or keep using it. So I really want to talk about the misconceptions about React Native and align our expectations from that framework. Uh, because some people think it's going to be too slow for them, or they do experience some slowness. So I want to talk about that issue. And I think the problem really starts in the way Facebook brands React Native, because the way they market it is they market it as a fully native framework, which is not true, because React Native is built on two parts. There's the JavaScript part, and then there's the native part, depending on the platform that you're using. And React Native is using a bridge to connect between the two. And each time it sends information on the bridge, it costs in a very expensive latency. And so inherently, React Native is not native anymore because JavaScript is not controlling the native views directly, just like in the web browsers. So be aware of that. Also, Facebook have been talking recently about a project that they're working on, a project called Lightspeed, where they're gonna recreate their Messenger app and make it a whole lot faster. And you can get the assumption that they are ditching React Native in order to achieve that. Also, AirBNB have been talking recently about how they're going to leave React Native and focus solely on Android and iOS separately using their native APIs. So I have a vast experience of like a very strong JavaScript background, and recently for the past half a year, I've been working on a full stack app, and I used React Native for the front end. And for 80% of the app development purposes, React Native was excellent, except for some parts where I had to use pretty complex components. And these components, they used constant communication with the JavaScript part using the bridge. And this is why they were very slow. So let's say even if you're using a list view in React Native, so multiply that latency by several times and you get a very slow app. So there's a problem right there. So in order to overcome this problem, you would need to implement that specific screen or component fully using a native API and then wrap it and connect it to the React Native part. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a strong Android background or strong iOS background. If you're a JavaScript developer like me, React Native is going to be excellent for you, again, for 80% of the app. But for the rest of it, will have to read a little bit about Android app development and iOS app development, but in very specific parts. And then you wrap it, which I do anyways when I use React Context API. So yeah, it's extremely useful. In the case of Facebook and their project called Lightspeed, of course, native app is gonna be a lot faster than not a whole lot. It's gonna be faster, and for some specific components that rest 80 20 or 10% it's going to be faster, then yes, it's a good decision if they really want to achieve the best performance. But think about the costs of having such thing. If you're an individual developer, you cannot afford hiring someone who knows iOS development and Android development, two developers, and also you would need to maintain both. So assuming that, not assuming, let's say that you want to develop an MVP very quickly, then you cannot afford that. So React Native is extremely useful for these purposes. You can do that quickly and efficiently if you know what you're doing and you're a good JavaScript developer and you know how to use React in an optimal way. So in the case of AirBNB, the reason, based on what I read, okay, the reason why they left React Native is because they already had an existing app in Android and iOS, and they wanted to connect the parts which already existed into React Native and continue their development flow using React Native solely, but they discovered that the migration is not going to be easy. So what we can learn from that is that if you have an existing app implemented separately for each platform, it's not a good idea to try and migrate to React Native. But again, I would recommend it for JavaScript developers only with a strong JavaScript background, who are willing to make some adjustments for some components. And for MVPs, you can also not use these components. You can just compromise somehow, just in order to have this MVP, this most viable product, and ship it quickly. So you can do that only with React Native. It's great. Also, something that I learned recently. So if you're serious about having your app running on both Android and iOS, you would need to have at least one Apple device in order to do so. And you'll have to pay for a development account in order to publish it to iStore. And Apple really built it in a way that you'll have to do so because they're greedy. So if you don't have any Apple hardware, you'll have to invest this couple of thousands of dollars if you're serious about building your app to this kind of platform. What I tried to do in order to work around it was I used a service called Mac and Cloud, where you can hire, where you can pay for a remote desktop and connect to it remotely. But there were tons of latency, so development experience wasn't very good. And also when I tried to log in with my Apple account to the device, I couldn't do so for reasons I'm not familiar with. Probably Apple put these limitations on purpose, so you wouldn't do that and you would actually buy some of their hardware. So be aware of that. It's not a progressive web app where you can simply run it on the browser and use it and test it. You'll have to build it if you want to actually ship it. So that's my take on React Native. Yeah, I would totally recommend that. But for JavaScript developers, if you're another JavaScript developer and you come from a strong Android background or iOS background, you would have to learn JavaScript and React in order to use React Native, and you wouldn't get away from having to learn Swift a little bit in order to develop some iOS components and also build it for iOS. So hopefully it was useful for anyone who's looking right now to develop a new app or maybe migrate to React Native. Yeah, so that's it. I really want to know what you're thinking about that, so feel free to comment. And Have a great week.